Hello friends, welcome to CEC Live Lectures. Dear friends, with our ongoing series in English translation in Indian writings, today we are going to talk on Premchand as well as on Tagore, and for this discussion on Tagore and Premchand, we have with us in our studios Professor Anand Prakash. Professor Anand Prakash is a retired professor of English from Delhi University. Dr. Prakash has immense experience, and his experience always helps us out in understanding the various topics in detail. Through him, we are always enlightened and we get in-depth knowledge as well as a path towards light as well as life. Friends, if you want to ask questions from Professor Prakash on today's topic, then do call us through our toll-free number. Our toll-free number is 1800-110-430. I repeat, our number is 1800-110-430. All dear friends are requested to call in the last 10 minutes so that first of all you get in-depth knowledge on today's topic, and afterwards in the last 10 minutes we promise to give answers to your questions through Professor Prakash. So let's welcome our guest and let's try to have a vivacious session today. Hello sir, welcome to the lecture.
Thank you, Geetika, for your kind words, and welcome viewers, good morning to you. And today's discussion would be on Tagore and Premchand, and there have been other occasions on which this topic has been taken up, but I'll be making some points that were not shared earlier. And in any case, the more important job for us, all of us, that is you and me, is to historicize these personalities. And when I say historicize, then what I mean is that these people should be seen against the background where they worked. So there was a time behind them, there were incidents around them, there was a social atmosphere that these people shared with the readers and others. And it will be then important that we see the times as well as these people. And these two, Tagore and Premchand, are two giants and pillars of Indian writing, and they are available in English translation at various levels. Both of them have been translated in different languages of the world, and people know about them as voices of their age. Initially, I would be talking about Tagore. I'll make a few points, and then these points can be considered in detail by you. And if you have anything to ask, then towards the end, as our anchor suggested, you can put questions to me, and then we can discuss them further. So first take Tagore, and the question to be raised in the context of Tagore is to which period did he belong, and whether he was able to establish a kind of vital connect with the time in which he lived. And secondly, whether he was able to identify those voices, those feelings, those emotions that his period generated, and how worked out these things in his writing and presented for the benefit of the reader. So first Tagore, and the point I start with in this regard is that this person, Tagore, the great writer that we have, can be called the voice of feeling rooted in materialism. This statement has implications, but is he the voice of feeling, and does feeling have a voice? And if he is a voice of the feeling of his times, then what that voice is and how it is a voice. So these are the things that you have to consider while listening to me and thinking about Tagore. When I say feeling, then I realize that it's different from thoughts. It's different from the intellectual response that he had. He was with the times, in the sense that there were such specific feelings in his time, and these feelings made their home in his mind, and there Tagore would be articulating these feelings in his creative writing. Is he a voice of feeling? You should ask this question from yourself. I should ask this question from myself. And I realized that there are specific things in his time which were not there before, and later on they might have evolved much further. But then what were those feelings at that point of time? When I say this word, then I know that Tagore is writing in the 1880s. He is born in 1860s, 1861 to be precise. And in the 1880s, he is a young man of 20 years or so. And he is looking around alertly, curiously about what is happening around him. And we know that India in the 1880s is entirely, totally different from what it was in the initial years of the 19th century. People are mobilizing, themselves to, ascertain the nature of their surroundings, and there are people in India who invest, their money and their resources in production. There are political thinkers who are partly taking ideas from the British, partly from their own experiences, and they realize that the Britishers are a presence which can be called problematic. They were rulers, Britishers in the latter half of the 19th century, were officially the rulers of India, and as rulers they were having certain interests in mind, and those interests were not exactly, precisely of the Indian reality, of the Indian masses. So this idea that these people lived in the 1880s in order to further the interests of India, and they were not doing it, and their inspiration came from somewhere else. It came from England, back home, and there were certain policies regarding India that were forged not in India but in Britain, and the British traders and the British producers, the British industrialists, they were putting an eye on India as a kind of resource that they will be using in order to further their economic interests. Now, this thing was not clear to them, let's say in the 1860s, 1870s, but when Tagore is a young man, then he realizes that India is having an identity which is independent, which has its own interests, and that there is some kind of a clash taking place somewhere in the minds of the Indian people. So he sees this in the 1880s, and one pointer to this particular fact is the formation of an organization called Congress. It's called Indian National Congress, and this comes up in the 1880s. So 1885 is the precise year when this happened, and Tagore at that point of time would be 24 years, and he would see that there is an organization in India in the 1885 year, and that this organization is to look after the interests of India as a country, not the interests of anybody else. And it doesn't matter who headed it. It was an Englishman who headed Indian National Congress at that time, but then the identity of India was recognized as independent in that year. Now, there would have been reasons why this particular organization came into being in 1885, and Tagore as a writer would feel the presence of India's interests at that point of time, and the voice that India attained then. And this is where the writer comes in. The writer knows that he is feeling safe with an organization which has come into being, and that he should now define his own parameters, the intellectual and creative parameters, and these parameters then will shape his sensibility and shape his writing. So what is the feeling? The feeling is of curiosity. The feeling is of something happening somewhere which doesn't leave you relaxed, which doesn't leave you at peace with yourself, and that something is happening somewhere in the background, and that is knocking at the door of the senses of the writer, and the writer feels uncertain. So this is the feeling. So uncertainty, curiosity, the urge to learn, these are the things that are in the air in the 1880s, and Tagore as a young man is responding to this atmosphere at that point of time. So this feeling is a feeling of discontent. There is a feeling of unease, and that unease is showing in his writing, in his poetry, and he's asking questions, and he's looking at certain sections of society at that point of time, and those sections are not exactly happy sections. For instance, his feelings emanate from the scene in which he is a participant. If that is the case and the feeling is of uncertainty, then uncertainty should be somewhere. It's not there, of course, in the supreme power called God. It's not there in religion. It's not there in tradition. It's a new feeling. And as a writer, Tagore is able to see that this feeling is emanating from his background. When I say this, and I have suggested certain things without saying them openly, then I realize that these feelings have a kind of basis in the reality of his time. And if there is a base in the reality of the time, then it is a materialist feeling. Materialist, the actual feeling, the feeling that is there around him, the feeling that is rooted in the background of the time. So I call it a materialist feeling, the feeling of unease, the feeling of curiosity. And it is this feeling that will finally pose very important questions to Tagore as to who he is, what he finds useful, what he finds wrong, what he finds bad. What is the thing that is supposed to be found answers to? And if you read his prose writings of the time, if you read his short stories, for instance, if you focus upon the selection of characters that he has made to make them a part of his fiction and his poetry, then you would realize that he's finding answers. Not that he has found the answers, but he's trying to find the answers in the background to which he belongs. So it's a materialist feeling, and this gives a new perspective to his writing. Writers in India at that time generally would seek inspiration from somewhere else, but this person, Tagore, is seeking inspiration from his background, and therefore I call it the materialist feeling that he has. He is responding to the challenges of the circumstance that are in front of him. Now, what exactly is in the background that is shaping his feeling at that point of time? And I realize when I look at his writings of the period that his characters give us a clue, and his characters are women, and these characters, these women, they belong to the village, and they are facing kind of oppression from the elders and superiors and males at home, in the neighborhood, and elsewhere. And what do these women think as characters? At the same, you know that the moment one identifies oneself with the voice of the feelings of the sensibility of women characters, that very moment one is in touch with the clashes that occur in society, because women are recipients of all kinds of threats, all kinds of pressures from males, from the family, from religion, from all traditions. And if the writer is sympathetic towards women, then he has a critical perspective. Then he looks at the society critically, asking questions about it, and read his stories, and you find that these women characters are not happy, and they are able to point fingers at those people who are actually their suppressors, their oppressors. So I ask a rhetorical question from myself, and that question is that if these characters, these women, are removed from his fiction, then what would happen? Then, of course, Tagore would be out of touch with the reality of his time. So the point where he connects with his world is the experience of women of his time, and this gives him that kind of dynamic which will make him a great writer. This person in 1880s, when he writes in 1890s, when he writes in the opening years of the 20th century, at that time he's a mature 40-year-old man, and when the First World War will come, that is 1914. So these are the years which start determining as well as inspiring his writing. And you will see that the feeling that was there. I talk about this feeling of curiosity and uncertainty and unease in the 1880s. This feeling will then materialize into, shape itself into a kind of a solid presence in his writing. So you see that this feeling finally becomes a determining, shaping factor of his writing, and this is what is important, and this makes him a great writer. So I repeat that rhetorical question that I pose to myself, and you can also consider this question from your own angle. remove the woman in her writing at this time from his fictional writing in short stories and novels, and then you might remain, cognizant of. You start thinking, that he's talking about a lofty view, a high view, a view of nature, a view of myth. He'll go into India, he'll go into skies, he'll go into waters, oceans, seas, rivers, and myths. So put him back in the old mode, the mode of feeling, and then he'll talk about India of the time. So this is Tagore has two very important dimensions to his poetic and his literary personality: the dimension of nature on one side and the dimension of social reality on the other. Social reality, women's experience; social reality, poor people's experience; social reality, the people who labor but do not get enough to sustain themselves, even though they are working very hard. This is the social reality, and Tagore is very angry about this when he is talking about it. In his plays, in the latter part of his life, which he'll present and which he'll produce, and in which he might also act. These plays talk about the problems of life, and if these problems are taken away, as in some cases, as in some poems, he has some longer poems where he's talking about myths, and he's talking about stories, he's talking about legends. Then he will have that kind of loftiness. And Tagore, when he talks, and I repeat, when Tagore talks about the social experience, then he takes up all these important, concrete questions of the day. So this is what Tagore does in the context of his writing. Now, when I say that a kind of feeling finally starts shaping itself in a concrete form, then let's go back to his own time. What is happening in his circumstance in the 1880s, 90s, and later, the first 10, 20 years, and you realize that India itself is shaping and is attaining, is moving in a certain direction. India, which was apprehensive, which was uncertain, which was critical of the presence of rulers who belonged elsewhere, this India now is preparing itself to resist the presence of the supposed superiors, because they are the rulers. And this India, writers have this knack of feeling and knowing what is happening around them, and Tagore is having that critical eye all the time fixed on the India of his time. And India, which started organizing itself, mobilizing itself in the 1880s as a political, as an economic political organization, a colony which was becoming conscious of itself. And if the colony becomes conscious of itself, then it becomes also conscious of the threats that emanate from somewhere else, from the center of power. The center of power in India then is England, and the subject, the subject of that power, the subjection of India at the hands of that power, that is something that raises its head in front of the writer, and the writer takes puts his attention on it, and then he writes. So this India is finally becoming an India as we call it today. Maybe in the 1880s it wasn't that kind of India, except at a few urban centers. In the villages, people would not know that they are a cluster that is a part of the country as a whole. They may not know it very clearly. They might know Bharat and all, but there would also be regions. There would also be belief systems, faith systems, which would take them away from the feeling of one country. India at that point of time is not one country in the sense we know the word and the term today. So India is moving in that direction of becoming one, and this becoming one is being shaped by the writer. The writer is imagining that there are certain factors in human social life at that time which connect them with one another, and that connection finally would become India as a country. And the moment India becomes a country, then the other country which is here, and that is Britain, then that country also will be clearly emerging in a crystallized form in the mind of the writer. So this time, that is going in that direction. This time is inspiring the writer to go along with it. So if India is emerging, India is developing, then the author also is developing. This is the logic, that I want to share with you. That in Tagore's time, India and Tagore, the country and the writer, they are evolving, at a parallel level. Both are evolving together. Then, I come to the final point regarding Tagore, and I say that the time then, is of a political nature. It's not the time of, just the social nature. The time is not that it will be stable. In fact, there will be more and more of instability, and with instability will come the urge to change it. So change, the urge to change, the inspiration that is coming from somewhere, all these things will combine together, and then this combining of the time, this combining of society will be voiced in, will be expressed in the writing of Tagore. So you will see that if India is preparing itself for resistance, then Tagore's writing itself is facing those questions which will contribute to the idea of resistance in his writing. So the last point that I make is that Tagore starts then considering the political changes that happen in India in his writing. There is a novel that he writes in the first few years of the 20th century. It is happening in his own mind. That particular year, that in India's history, 1905, is the year when people are becoming more and more angry. Now they are not merely asking questions; they are answering questions, and they are participating in a kind of resistance on the basis of the question that they asked earlier. So they have the answers. Now Tagore's job as a writer at that time is to find out whether those answers are wrong or right. Because after all, when I'm faced, when as a person, as a citizen, I'm faced with certain questions and I have certain answers, then it's not necessary that my questions are right, or that the answers to the question that I get, they are right. So the writer's job then is to reflect on, is to think about those answers which the country is getting from their own experience, and whether the country itself is critical enough to understand the nature of the questions and the nature of the answers. And the writer that Tagore is very conscious about the implications of his feeling, the implications of his experience, and he writes this novel particularly. I take it up. This Home and the World is the novel. And this novel, is raising political questions, and very uncomfortable political questions. And the debates that are going on in society at the time, in the 1910s and later, these questions are being raised by Tagore. And for instance, the title itself of the novel is important. It is Ghare Bahre, the home and the world. That there is a world of home and there is a world of outside. And what is the world of home? The world of home is the world of family, and the world of family has at its center a woman, and this woman, there is a boundary, a wall, that the woman faces, and the boundary wall is the courtyard. She belongs to the courtyard, but is the world outside? Bahre. The woman asks this question, and somebody answers it, and she accepts the answer. Wrongly or rightly, one can't say, because the woman doesn't understand. So Tagore picks up a woman, he puts her in the courtyard, and later on her back is towards the courtyard and his face is towards the world outside. Should she cross the boundary of the courtyard? Should she go out? Should she take part in society outside? This is the question Tagore is raising. It's not an easy question to ask, and there are no answers to it. Should women, as women, should citizens, of the time, leave their neighborhood and come out into the open and ask questions of a political nature? This is what Tagore is putting forward in this case, and the answers, he is not getting any answers, but he definitely making it a point of debate. So there would be characters in this novel who will agree with the woman that she should go out and take part in the social action, and there are others who think that should not happen, because maybe the world outside is too threatening, is too difficult to handle, and the woman would finally end up in grief. Who is right? Now our husband, is a very liberal person. He keeps his ears and eyes open. He all the time thinks. He has sympathy for his wife. He has sympathy for the woman I am talking about. And he says, okay, I don't have the answer. Maybe you also don't have the answer. He thinks about the woman. And he then says, okay, you decide yourself. In fact, this is a new kind of a person. And Tagore is able to visualize this person in his novel. The husband is not dictating terms to his wife. Even today, friends, I would find very few husbands, apart from the enlightened sections, who would give this kind of a liberty to the woman, that she can decide herself and make mistakes. Most of the husbands, most of the family structures, they would always tell the woman, follow the dictum of tradition. Follow what your mother, what your mother-in-law, what your grandmother, what your grandmother-in-law followed. And the husband either would accept this fact, or at least he would look the other way and would tell very clearly the woman that it's risky. This character I am talking about, Nikhil, in the novel, this character is actually giving freedom to his wife to adopt her own course and to realize, that if you have to decide, then you decide yourself. But so far as I am concerned, I don't have the answers. What is this question? This question is not about family. This question is not about the individual woman. This actually is a social question. The people bound in the family tradition, the people who have a course charted for themselves by tradition, these people are faced with the question whether they should take part against something that is outside their purview. That is the rulers. Rulers' job is to rule, and the people's job is to follow the rules of the dictum of the rulers. This is the usual thing. But then India is at a crossroads. India now wants to ask the question: should we take part in the making of the policies, or should we just accept the policies that are forged elsewhere? Good question, but a political question. And naturally, in the natural sense, Tagore then becomes a kind of a party to a new situation, and that situation is of change. Ask questions, make experiments, and follow the follow the consequences of what you have done. So we have discussed this, and when we break here, and then we resume the discussion in the next session of the lecture. Thank you.
With this note, thank you, sir. Thank you so very much for giving us a productive session. And dear friends, we believe that you are learning a lot through the session today, and we will be back after a short break and would be discussing further. Hello friends, welcome back to this session where we are talking about Tagore and Premchand, and we believe that these sessions appear to be very beneficial to you, as we always believe in giving you the content which is useful to you. So friends, I would like to request Professor Anand Prakash once again to continue further so that you could get more and more of knowledge on today's topic. Welcome back, sir, and we would like to continue further.
Thank you, Geetika. And now we resume the discussion. And I made a specific point about Tagore, who was, becoming more and more aware about the social and the cultural needs of the country through his writing, through his cultural behavior. And Tagore is followed by Premchand closely. Historically speaking, Tagore is born in 1861 and Premchand is born in 1880. So 19-20 years gap between the two, and Premchand would be conscious about the reality of the time in the closing years of the 19th century, and he'll start writing soon after that, and around 1900 he would write short stories, he would read a lot, he would adopt a language that was available to him from his family, from his neighborhood, and that language was Urdu, then the Khadi Boli in the Urdu Persian script. And he would write in that, and he would not at that point of time be very conscious about the language that he is using, because this is available to him and he can communicate through it very well. He knows Persian, he knows Urdu. And he has his eyes open, and it's a tumultuous kind of atmosphere that is building up around him. 1890s is a very a difficult period, not just for India as a colony, but for the Western world also. And economic crisis is occurring, and colonialism is facing threat from forces of resistance in different parts of the world. England is very strong, Germany is very strong, France is very strong at the time, but that strength is somehow gradually diminishing. The countries are becoming weak because colony now is being superseded by another kind of factor, which is economic in nature. Colony meant that people had to be suppressed, they had to be conquered, they had to be kept under check. People in the colonies, that is. But then, as soon as this process of checking stabilizes, other forces are unleashed. For instance, in the colony, then there are certain sections, not merely in the colonial world, but also in that particular part of the colony, where the colonial master sits. I am talking about India on one side, and I am talking about England on the other. So both in India and in England, certain factors are now emerging. Those factors were not there in the 19th century. Those factors are the forces of production. And if forces of production are taking a direction which is more specific than just the colonial power, because the colonial power subjugates people, but the forces of production then say, okay, let's start producing in the colony as well as at the center. So it's not just the market that colony is taken as, but also as the center of production. So anyway, I'll not go into it. I'm not an expert in this area, but I would say that sometime in the 1890s, India is becoming also a productive center, a center of production. And England itself is interested in investing money in the Indian industries. So it's a different kind of a thing. I would call it imperialism and not colonialism, but that's a topic that slightly is outside my purview. But what I say is that India is changing at the economic social level in 1890s, and Premchand, as a young man of 15 years, 20 years, in the closing years of the 19th century, is watching this phenomena from close quarters as a writer. Viewers, you would know that India in the 19th century and the early years of the 20th century was not the India that we have today, and where writers are supposed to sing of beauty and sing of music and all those things, using the structure of the music, using the structure of art, using the structure of painting. In writing, one can paint through words. And you can use words, which are poetic in nature and which are so fluid, which are so soft, that they start moving towards music, all those things. So literature today might be called an aesthetic experience or an aesthetic mode. But in the 19th century, when this literature is being used by writers to express themselves, then it is not aesthetic as much as it would be later, aesthetic in the limited sense of the word. So Premchand would not write a short story that will appeal to the feelings of the masses, give them softer feelings, give them some kind of a sense of sweetness. He would be writing fiction in order to respond to the situation in which he is there, and that situation is outside the domain of literature. It's the domain of society. So Premchand would feel suffocated in the opening years of the 20th century, and the suffocation shows in his writings. In fact, he's a young man and he's very sensitive, so he will write short stories and he will think about the questions that will bring in purview and that will bring under attention the presence of the colonial master, directly or indirectly. Indirectly is where writers can feel safe, but then that indirect representation can also raise suspicions and doubts in the minds of the master. And there is a word that Premchand is using in his first collection of short stories published then, and there he is using the word Vatan. And if a writer in the latter half of the 19th century and the first few decades of the 20th century is using the word Vatan, then it has political connotations. What does he mean by Vatan? Vatan is my country, my place of birth. So the writer talks about place of birth. If writer is talking about one's country, then one is not talking about God. One is not talking about tradition. One is talking about one's state of affairs. And when the word Vatan is used, and Premchand is an employee of the government, then the government would say, what do you mean by Vatan? You are a writer, and you are supposed to talk about faith and celebration and rituals and traditions and all those things. Why are you talking about Vatan? So Premchand, and the second word that Premchand uses is soze Vatan. It's Vatan, but the source of it, the lament of it. You have a kind of grievance. You feel sad, and that sadness is very intense, and there is a kind of anger mixed in that sadness. So he is using the word lament, using the word soz, and he calls it soze Vatan. And he publishes it, and the masters, the political masters, the Britishers, they take a serious note of it, a serious view of it, and they say this person is actually inciting the reader against us, against the Britishers. So what happens then? If Premchand is publishing a short story collection called Soze Vatan in the first decade of the 20th century, and he is writing 4 or 5 stories there, and those stories raise questions of somebody's presence or somebody's unhappiness, some characters feeling dissatisfied with their fate, with their situation, what would the ruling regime of which Premchand is an employee feel? And you can expect some kind of harsh answer, harsh response from the authorities, and his book is suppressed. The copies are confiscated, and Premchand is given a warning that he is writing about Vatan and he is writing about lament. of the Watan. How can any regime tolerate? So what does it show on the part of the colonial master? It shows a kind of sense of suppression, a kind of order that is to be imposed on the person. At the same time, and do not forget that if the regime is intolerant, then the regime is weak. Only a weak person is intolerant, and which means that the country, the ruler of the country, the Britishers, they are feeling weak. And they mind if somebody criticizes them, and criticize in short stories. How many would read Premchand's short stories in the early part of the 20th century? Maybe hundreds, not more than that. But then, why should an employee be allowed to express his feelings about Watan? This is the question. And because the political master, the colonial master, the Britishers, they feel that this person is breaking the ranks and coming against us and threatening us indirectly or directly. Then this colonial master is feeling weak. So Premchand then gets a warning. His book is taken away, and he is asked not to write. What should he do? Now Premchand started writing as under the name Dhanpat Rai, but now he'll use a different name. And he will not talk about political questions anymore. So what should he do? He'll talk about social questions then. Yes, he can talk about social questions. Later on, in his life, he would realize that the job is coming in his way. So either do a job or you write, which means that writing has to be from the margins. Writing has to be from the sides. The basic thing is to earn your bread and butter. It's a difficult question for a writer to sort out. Should he just bother about his bread and butter, and because he has to earn his livelihood, therefore should he compromise on his principles? It's a difficult question then. And Premchand takes a moral position on this, and he says that he will not go against his conscience, and that if there are problems regarding bread and butter, then he will face those problems at that level. So he will gradually become aware of the rod hanging on his head, and then he will find different ways to express himself. There is a connection with Tagore. Tagore was expressing the political questions in the opening of the 20th century, and Premchand is being punished for raising political questions. And what should his strategy then be? His strategy then would be to talk about society, and he takes to social reforms. What are the social reforms? The society is tradition ridden, it is orthodox. The views of the masses are views which take inspiration from the past, and the masses are not bothered about the present circumstance, and they are into the caste structure, and they are into the religious structure, and they believe in mental peace at a time when there is no bread and butter, at a time when there is unemployment. So can they have mental peace? Well, you close your eyes, you meditate, you think of God, and you think that someday God will help you, God will help me. That is what the religious thing is. But the hungry stomach, the hungry person cannot for long overlook and ignore the urges of the body, the urges of livelihood, the urges of sustaining oneself, and therefore religion will loosen its hold, and the writer at that point of time will look around and see as to where the answer to the problems lie. So Premchand then starts looking not at politics but at society of the time, and he raises questions at the social level. Now remember, I should remember it myself, that a writer talking about society doesn't mean that he is not raising political questions, but that he is raising political questions at a different level. So Premchand would be now talking against tradition. He would be talking against orthodoxy. He would be raising issues that relate him to the human beings and to their humanity inside them. What in Hindi can be called insaniyat. He'll now talk about insaniyat, and when he talks about humanity, insaniyat, karuna, compassion, all these words, then a new perspective will open before him. I do not think that Premchand will take to social reform even though the mode that he uses is the social reform mode. But in that social reform, there will be couched the critique of the society at the structural level. Family is a structure, the job situation is a structure, and agreeing with accepted policy is the structure. These are the structures, and you can always create characters who will be disturbed by the structure, and at the level of the structures, if this thing goes on for some time, then it turns political. So Premchand is taking this path of thinking about society at the time, and his writing actually becomes more popular now, because if he was reading, if he were at that point of time raising political questions, then only the intelligentsia, the middle class educated person who would read his stories and will think of the political questions. But if the writer is raising social questions, questions about caste, questions about honesty, questions about what is called dharma, the duty of the person, then people who are not intellectuals, people who are not educated, they also would listen to him. So imagine Premchand, unlike Tagore and others, he will not be raising questions at the political level. He will talk about ordinary things like sitting at home and people talk and they discuss ordinary things, and you think about dharma, you think about your personal duties. If he raises those questions, then more and more readers he will get. I maybe also later on take up the question of language that Premchand uses. Premchand will not use philosophical language. Premchand will not use very sharp ideological language. He will use the ordinary dialogue, the dialogue that people use in their daily movements and concerns. So he will go very close to dialect. There is also the interest at that time in the 1910s and 20s when Premchand would start using dialogue in order to take help from the vocabulary of the masses. And when that vocabulary comes, then the difficult words, whether of Persian or Sanskrit, they disappear. So Premchand's language also undergoes change, and people start reading his stories and his novels as if they were folk tales, and his folk tale part will connect him better with his reader. So this is what Premchand is doing, and his writing, particularly short stories, that will be anecdotal. He will say something through the short stories. At the end, there will be a message, and this message today we might call it aesthetically weak. But in the 1910s and 20s, this message will be very educative. In North India, and Premchand lived in Banaras most of his life, and in that part of India, were there schools in every village, every small town? No, they were not. Or if there were schools, then those schools would be up to the middle standard. Very few would be high schools, and in those, the education, the syllabi, etc., would not be exactly educative in that sense. So who would educate the masses? Premchand then decides to educate the masses through his short stories and through his novels. So he becomes a kind of a teacher in society, and that teacher is one who is talking about the problems of the people at that level. So he will become an educator. So imagine there is a colony called India which is backward, where you have unemployment there, you have orthodoxy there, and there is a writer who wants to then use the method of education to reach the masses. So this is what Premchand does. So Tagore reached this level with the help of politics, and Premchand reaches this level at the level of getting language closer to the life of the masses. And the two writers, they become then the true voices, the genuine voices of the social movement that happened in India at the time. So I would raise a few questions regarding Premchand now, as I did in the case of Tagore. Premchand forms himself as a writer in 1890s and around the First World War crucially. He is raising the questions of First World War not directly, but he is doing it crucially also at the same time. The third phase of evolution, which immediately will follow the First World War, would be in the 1930s. What is happening in the beginning of the 20th century? What is happening in the first, the second decade of the 20th century, and in the third or fourth decade of the 20th century? These are the questions that Premchand is addressing one after another. So initially, It might be social reform. When the World War happens, then he'll be talking about the family structure and the economic structure. He'll combine the two. He'll bring in trade, in a simple story like Panch Parameshwar. He can bring the idea of trade there. And when it comes to 1920s, then he can talk about the poverty and the exploitation, which is economic in nature. So the last phase in his life is the phase of criticism at the level of society, and you have heard his famous, you must have read, heard about and read his famous novel called Godan, and apparently the word Godan is semi-religious in the sense that somebody is donating a cow, is gifting a cow. It's a Godan. Somebody is giving a cow to somebody. It appears to be religious, but you know that cow or the calf or the bullocks, they belong to the village household, and the village household is tied to the land. So you just in one shot, Premchand is able to connect with the peasant in India, and that peasant is Hori in Godan, and there's a question of the cow, and the vocabulary of entire Godan is going around the cow and the bullocks, and you realize that Premchand has been able to use this symbol to go into the deeper layers of experience of the peasant. Does peasant have a future in India? Now this is a question that is being raised even today. The peasant doesn't seem to have a future. Now the peasant is being gradually replaced by a different kind of farming where he would have no role to play. There will be workers on the fields today, and they will be using tractors and not cows or bullocks, etc. So the world is changing, and peasant is being removed from the scene. And Premchand is able to show in Godan, which is written in the 1930s, it's published in 1936, the same year as Premchand dies, and that is at the peak of his writing, that this novel appears. So you realize that Premchand has finally come to the answer that peasant has no future. And when Hori dies, after that his son has already gone to the town, and in the town he has become a worker, and he doesn't have any interest in the land. And in fact, when he comes to the village later, then he realizes that his father also has lost his land. So if the peasant loses his land and the son has gone away to the city and become a labor, then one knows that that era has ended where peasant would be at the center of production. So this is, and it's a great novel in so many other respects also, that the peasant is bound by the traditions and the son is not. And the son, wants to marry, into a different kind of a structure, and he can also establish a relationship with other families, and he can do so, without inviting criticism from society. So Premchand is able to see this. What I am saying is, in this context, that Premchand is moving very fast from one stage of writing to another. Initially, he is talking about the criticism of the colonial master. In the second phase, he is using the social reform idea, and in the third phase, he is using the poverty of the peasant in order to become a realistic writer. And this realism actually is the realism of India also. India is becoming aware of its own problems at the cultural, social and economic level. And very soon, when Premchand dies in 1936, within 11 years, the country will become free. And Premchand can see that freedom coming, but he can see that freedom coming much more realistically than most of us did in the 1950s and 60s when the freedom had come. Because he raises those difficult questions, those uncomfortable questions in the novel Godan, where most of the intelligentsia in the country is not able to understand what's going to happen to India at that time. People were full of enthusiasm and excitement about India becoming free, and rightly so. But then at the same time, people were making their own plans to exploit this India differently as Indians. Premchand was able to see this in this novel, which was done in the 1936. So what I say is that this greatness is what Premchand and Tagore share with each other. They are 20 years apart from each other, but they share this greatness, that they will honestly, genuinely look at this India, see where it is heading, and whether the direction it is taking is the direction that one should take. So, at this stage I think that the point regarding Premchand and Tagore, the point about realism, the point about the requirements that are cultural in nature, these points have been stressed in both the writers, and it is these points that make these writers great writers in their own terms, unto themselves and unto the reader whose questions they are addressing. Thank you.
With this note, thank you, sir. Thank you so very much for giving us a vivacious session. Dear friends, we believe that you might have learned a lot from today's session, and if you want to see the lectures once more, then we would like to share with you all that you can watch the lecture on YouTube, as we are going to upload it on YouTube soon. You can watch the lecture with the help of our YouTube channel, that is www.youtube.com/CEC-UGC. Apart from this lecture, you can see all the lectures pertaining to the series Indian Writing in English Translation, as all the lectures are there on YouTube. Friends, we would be meeting again soon and would be discussing further, but before that, we would like to share that you can give your feedback on info.cec@nic.in. This is the ID where you can post your questions as well as your suggestions for our lectures. So we are taking your leave now. We would be meeting another day and would be discussing more and more. Till then, take care. Goodbye. Thank you, sir. Thank you once again.